And we are back on Primetime on ANC. At 12 noon today, Filipinos based here and abroad held simultaneous protests in front of China's consular offices to condemn China's supposed territorial aggression. The rallies aim to show the united stand of Filipinos against China's insistence on its 9-dash line and its occupation of Philippine territories in the disputed South China Sea. And you may be wondering, why hold these protests on July 24? Well, on this day last year, China created the Sansha Prefecture to oversee and administer 1 million square miles of the disputed territories.
That's right, Tony. Among those who joined the rally in Makati is former Interior Secretary Rafael Alunan, who urged China to face the issue in the international tribunal and not on the battlefield. Basically, the message was simple. If worst comes to worst, Filipinos are ready to defend the country's sovereignty, even if that means standing up against an economic and political powerhouse.
And for our discussion tonight, a powerhouse of guests joins us here in the studio. The lead conveners of the West Philippine Sea Coalition, former Interior Local Government Secretary Rafael Alunan III, and former Parañaque Representative and former National Security Advisor Roy Lugones.
Send us your comments and questions, please, through Twitter using the hashtag Primetime. Post your thoughts on our Facebook page. It's ANC 24/7. Gentlemen, good evening to you, and thanks for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting us.
It's not often we have two gentlemen of your stature to be with us here. I feel like the table is tilting towards that end.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on Primetime tonight. Now, you know, when we see these kinds of protests happening, you know, in the face of China itself, what would you think China's reaction would be? I mean, it's not going to make them even more sympathetic to our cause.
Well, I think they're bothered. I've been monitoring their newspapers, the so-called state-owned dailies like China Daily, People's Daily, and they're bothered because according to them, what we're doing is embarrassing them and shaming them in front of the whole world. But if they're ashamed of the truth, then let's keep on telling the world about the truth, about the illegality of their claim in the South China Sea, especially extending into the exclusive economic zones of several countries, including the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia. You know, mischief reef they took over in 1995 up to 1998. This is about 800 nautical miles from the southernmost island, Hainan. It's only 120, 130 nautical miles from Palawan.
Yeah.
Next, now they're controlling the internationally known Scarborough Shoal or Bajo de Masinloc. That's also the same distance, but amazingly, they're claiming that this is traditionally, and they're always using the word undisputed claim, well within our exclusive economic zone, using bully tactics, using their mass and their military might to do this.
I want to ask former Secretary Alunan, you know, during the time of President Ramos, he was already concerned about the intrusion by China into the Spratlys area, and that was just several years after the U.S. pulled out its bases from the Philippines. But where did we go from there? I mean, why did it seem that we never really took any firm action against China even then, during the early stages of its intrusion into the Spratlys?
Well, I don't know what happened after the presidency of FBR ended. I can't speak for the Estrada and the GMA administrations, but I think we know more or less what transpired during the previous administration before the current one, where one of the things that bothered the people was that we were getting too close to China and selling our patrimony to them. I do remember that in 1995 we had this problem with China on Mischief Reef. And shortly after we tangled with them, they set up structures, temporary structures, which they said they'd do that for their fishermen. And Roy, during the rally this afternoon showed permanent structures that were built by China thereafter.
Sure.
And they were actually military structures. Right? I mentioned in the rally that we ourselves are wondering what went wrong with China, because we've had a long history of good relations with China, even long before Magellan came to our shores. We had a history of amity and good trade, good trading relations. But it was only in this last 20 years, from 1995 to the present, 20 years or so, that things have soured. And I think that has to do with the fact that China has decided to abandon its policy of peaceful rise. And I think there are many motivations for that. But the single, I think, biggest motivation is that they need to control the resources of the South China Sea for their own continuity as a regional and global power.
Mr. Secretary, this morning as well, you had one message to China, and that was for them to face the issue head-on in the International Tribunal and not on the battlefield. The question now is, how do you bring them there? Considering that they don't recognize it, they refuse to recognize it, they don't even feel that there's an issue at all that they have to answer to, because to their minds, it's theirs for the taking.
Well, as we understand it, and we're getting this from the government, China and the U.S., and the Philippines are signatories to UNCLOS and the law of the sea. And UNCLOS has a provision that in the event of a territorial dispute, you can elevate it to ITLOS. And that's exactly what the Philippines has done. But China has arrogantly set that aside. They're now behaving as if though they're above the law. And that's the reason why I mentioned during the at the rally this afternoon that, with great power comes great responsibility. China is the second largest economy in the world, and it sits in the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member. Instead of heightening tensions and insecurities in the South China Sea, it should be behaving responsibly. And so we're throwing the challenge at China. If you want these provocations to, if we want the provocations to stop, if you don't want our protests to continue, then stop intruding into our EEZ.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Congressman Roy Lagolas. Of course, you spent some time in the National Security Agency. You must have gone over this problem with our strategists, our best strategists. Couldn't we have done something much earlier to actually get China to, or to stop China, to preempt it from pushing ahead with all of these intrusions into our territory?
During my time as NSA,
Yeah.
no such issue arose, because by that time there was already the issue of the permanent structures.
Yeah.
I'd like to show.
Sure.
This was the temporary shelter that they were talking about. They said, don't worry about it, that's temporary, that's only for fishermen.
What did they call them? I think they called it like Quonset huts or something.
Yes,
at the
well, they
beginning,
look
right?
like, they can be blown over by
The
a soft
typhoon.
wind.
Yeah.
But then, after about 5 years,
Right.
this is how it looks now. It's a fortress with troops there, guns, and even the helicopter.
But remember, there was a congressman who came over, U.S. Congressman Dana Rohrabacher.
Yeah, I
who
was,
even did a flyby.
Yeah, I was with him.
Yeah, exactly.
I was with him. And, I was there. I saw with my own 2 eyes the construction going on before this
Before it became like
the
that.
permanent structure. And
Yeah.
we already gave a warning about the permanent structures. But during my time as NSA, no such development happened. But when I was already a congressman and already in the opposition at that time, I happened to be the chairman of the technical working group, even if I was in the minority, designated by the Committee on Foreign Affairs. When we were tackling the baselines law, we recommended that the islands in the Spratlys area occupied by the Philippines should be designated as baselines. In other words, if that was allowed, then the sea between those islands and the mainland of the Philippines would be considered territorial sea.
Right.
When we already had that bill approved on practically on third reading, we had to have a meeting under pressure from a high-powered delegation of the Department of Foreign Affairs during the time of PGMA. And we were virtually pressured to change that into regime of islands, so
Exactly.
that the body of water will become international sea, even though that would still remain as mostly part of our exclusive economic zone. That was the only incident, but that's small, of a legislative incident.
But why do you think there was that kind of pressure coming from the DFA at the time?
Well, we'd develop a big chunk of body of water. It would increase our territorial sea, and of course that would strengthen our position during that time, to the detriment of their so-called 9-dash line, which only they are recognizing.
No, but it was our own diplomats, not the Chinese, who were trying to pressure Congress into changing the provisions of the baseline bill.
Well, maybe they're the buffer.
The buffer.
The pressure came from somewhere else.
But why didn't you speak out then?
We
you
did.
knew back then that it
We
was
did.
wrong.
We
But then
did.
you still included it, and it's still the regime
We
of
did,
islands.
but the committee had to agree under pressure from the executive. That's the sad part of it. I was in the minority, but you know, this one is another example, and then Scarborough Shoal is another example of you know. I'd like to comment on ITLOS.
Yeah.
You know, ITLOS, China can ignore ITLOS, but ITLOS will not ignore China, because whatever is the position of China, they may say, oh, we'll not submit our position there, we'll ignore it. But ITLOS can make a decision. And even if that decision may not be enforceable because of the realities, that would still be very embarrassing to China. That would put a black mark on their claim and shame them internationally.
Do you think, though, that they will...
Demolish the so-called 9-dash lines and weaken them very considerably.
Yeah, but do you think that they will actually really mind that?
Of course, I think they'd mind that, because a country like China would like to have respectability at the end of the day. Judging from their pronouncements, judging from the pronouncements that we read in the papers. Although every now and then they have this veiled message from an unofficial source that they're going to attack us.
Yeah, I'm going to read part of what Representative Walden Bello wrote along with Rodel Rodis. I understand he's one of the immigration lawyers in the U.S.,
Yes,
right?
and a community leader as
Right.
well.
And he was, both of them were quoting what supposedly is attributed to a Major General Zhang Zhaozong, who said that they wanted a naval presence to surround Filipino detachments, starve them, prevent reinforcements from reaching them. Is that kind of military strategy even authorized at the highest levels of the Chinese Central Committee?